The convoy moved at night. 7 hearses, black as the space between stars, running without lights down a highway that hadn't seen a working traffic signal in 11 months. Reyes watched them from the ridge, belly flat on cooling asphalt. The stolen optics pressed hard against her face until the rubber seal left a ring around her eye socket. She counted the vehicles twice, the way Sergeant Okafor had taught her before the Pale took him in Tulsa. Count twice. Assume you missed one. Act accordingly. She'd missed one. The 8th vehicle came last, longer than the others. Lower, its silhouette wrong, in a way she couldn't immediately name. It took her a moment to understand that it wasn't riding on wheels at all. It was hovering, just barely. Just enough that the road dust didn't stir beneath it. Whatever was inside, the Pale didn't want it jostled. She slid back from the ridge and ran. The town of Harwick had 3 things left. A water tower that still worked, a hardware store that hadn't been looted because the looters were all dead, and a 12-year-old boy named Denny Cale, who had turned the eastern half of Main Street into the most elaborately dangerous 300 meters of real estate in the continental United States. Reyes had met him 6 weeks ago when she'd stepped on a pressure plate outside the pharmacy, and a bucket of ball bearings had swung down from the awning and missed her head by 4 inches. Denny had watched from a second-floor window with the expression of a craftsman, disappointed by his own work. "You were supposed to trip it with your foot," he'd said. "Not your knee." She'd recruited him on the spot. The 3rd thing Harwick had was Captain Del Marrow, formerly of the 5th Ranger Battalion, currently of absolutely nothing, sitting in the back of a repurposed ambulance with his left hand, wrapped in a bandage that needed changing and a flask that needed refilling. He was 53 years old and had the face of a man who'd been shown the end of the world and hadn't blinked hard enough. Reyes found him already awake. He always seemed to be awake. 8 vehicles, she said. One of them isn't touching the ground. He took a sip from the flask, passed it to her without being asked. "They're moving the architect." "We don't know that. We know the Pale doesn't float things they don't care about." He stood, joints audible in the silence. "Wake the kid." Denny was already in the doorway, jacket on, a satchel over one shoulder that clinked faintly when he moved. He'd been listening the whole time. He always was. "I set 3 more on the north approach last night," he said. "Compression triggers. The Pale don't weigh what people weigh, so I calibrated for." "Show me when we get there," Marrow said. The boy nodded once, very precisely, and walked out into the dark. Reyes watched him go. There was something in the way Denny moved. Careful, deliberate, utterly without fear. That reminded her of the soldiers she'd most respected and most mourned. The ones who'd stopped flinching early because flinching cost fractions of seconds. And fractions of seconds cost everything. He'd learned it the hard way, she knew. The Pale had come to Harwick 8 months ago and taken everyone. His parents, his teachers, the hardware store owner who'd apparently been teaching him to set electrical work before the invasion. Everyone. Denny had not left. He'd stayed and turned his grief into wire and weight and trigger mechanisms, and he'd waited for someone worth fighting alongside. She hoped she was worth it. The convoy had stopped at the old Harwick refrigeration plant, a long, low building on the south edge of town that the Pale seemed to have been using as a processing site for at least 2 months. Reyes had scouted it before but never gotten close. The Sentinel spheres, the Pale's autonomous drone weapons, patrolled the perimeter in looping, irregular orbits that made them nearly impossible to time. They were the size of softballs, chrome bright, and they moved faster than anything biological had a right to be afraid of. She'd watched one take down a deer from 40 meters at the research station in Reno. She'd seen what they did on the way in. They didn't kill you immediately. That would have been easier. The Pale called themselves nothing, as far as humans had been able to determine. The word Pale had come from their color, the lead white skin of the architect caste, the administrators, the ones who directed the collectors and the drones and the sentinels. 3 months after first contact, a linguist named Harrington at the Austin Enclave had proposed that the Pale's species name, insofar as it could be phonetically transcribed, sounded something like the continuing. They were ancient. They had been harvesting biological material from inhabited worlds for a long time. The process was elegant in its terrible efficiency. Drones to subdue and retrieve, sentinels to guard and kill, collectors to process, and the architect to coordinate, to evaluate, to decide what was kept and what was converted. What was converted became more sentinels. That was the part Reyes tried not to think about too directly. Marrow had laid out what he knew 3 weeks ago, the night they'd received the fragment of encrypted transmission from the Enclave at Portland. The Pale had a weakness. Not a vulnerability in the sense of a weak point you could target, more like a condition they avoided. Cold. Extreme, sustained cold disrupted something in their biology. Some process in the architect cast that the collectors and drones didn't share. It wasn't a kill condition. The reports from the Vancouver engagement suggested the architects could survive cold exposure for short periods. But it slowed them, clouded their coordination, severed the tight band link they maintained with their sentinel spheres. Without that link, the spheres went dumb. They'd still move, still seek heat signatures, but the eerie precision that made them nearly impossible to evade dropped to something a competent shot could handle. The refrigeration plant had 4 functional cryo-storage chambers, each capable of dropping to -80 Celsius. Marrow had obtained this information from a former logistics manager named Ferris who'd worked the facility before the Pale arrived, and who was now dead, and whose information Marrow had committed to memory with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the people who knew things had a shorter life expectancy than the things they knew. They approached from the north, Denny first, moving through his own minefield with the practiced ease of a child walking to school. He stepped over things Reyes couldn't see in the dark, tugged a wire aside here, thumbed a pin back into a housing there, creating a corridor through his work. She followed exactly in his footsteps. Behind her, Marrow did the same. Though Shinosik, he gave slightly more clearance to the objects Denny had gestured toward with the most care. The Pale had 2 collectors stationed outside the south entrance. Not the small ones, the processing units, barely taller than a man. These were the heavy variants, the ones with the elongated torsos and the 4 upper limbs. The ones that moved like something between a praying mantis and a pallbearer. They stood motionless in the way the Pale stood motionless, not relaxed but waiting, fully present, watchful in a manner that had no analog in human posture. Denny pointed to the roofline. 3 sentinels in slow orbit, figure 8 pattern, 7-second intervals between each pass over the main entrance. Reyes watched them twice through the optics, 3 times. She counted the intervals, 7.5 seconds, average, with a variance of roughly 1 second either direction. She looked at Marrow. He was already doing the same calculation. She could tell by the stillness of his face. "Kid," he said quietly, "you said you had something for the spheres." Denny opened his satchel and produced what looked, at first, like a modified EMP device from a standard military kit. It was not standard military kit. He'd built it from components, scavenged from the hardware store, and 3 different vehicles over the course of 2 months. Guided by instructions he'd obtained from a radio conversation with an engineer in Denver who was now, like most of Denver, unreachable. It would produce a directed electromagnetic pulse strong enough to disable a sentinel sphere at close range. Close range meaning approximately 4 meters, meaning you had to let it come to you. "1 shot," Denny said. "I can reset it, but it takes about 40 seconds. How many do we have?" He held up 2 fingers. Then, after a brief pause, a third. "I made a spare." Marrow looked at the boy for a long moment. Something moved in his face that Reyes had not seen there before. It wasn't pride exactly. It was something quieter and harder to name, the look of a man who has been in the presence of something unexpectedly admirable and is not sure whether to feel hope or grief. "Good kid," he said. It came out rough, like the words had friction. Denny just nodded and put the device back in his satchel. They moved on the south entrance at C-300. When the Pale's collectors entered what the Portland Enclave researchers had theorized was a maintenance cycle. Not sleep. Nothing the Pale did resembled sleep, but a period of reduced environmental scanning, internal diagnostics, a tightening of focus inward. It lasted between 8 and 14 minutes. It was the closest thing to a window they were going to get. The first collector noticed them at 12 meters. It didn't shout or signal. The Pale didn't do that. It simply oriented, the 4 upper limbs drawing inward, and began to move toward them with the brisk, soundless efficiency of a thing that had done this before and would do it again, and felt nothing about it either way. Marrow shot it twice with the suppressed rifle he'd taken from a dead Marine in Reno. Both shots center mass. The collectors slowed, staggered. They were harder to drop than anything, with a comparable silhouette had a right to be. And then the third shot, The one Reyes put through the base of its elongated skull brought it down. The second collector had already turned and was 3 steps into a run for the entrance. Denny stepped out from behind the drainage pipe he'd been using as cover, planted his feet, and put a round from his salvaged pistol through the back of its knee joint. The gap in the pail's otherwise near-impenetrable outer layer, the articulation points, the places where the material had to flex. He'd been studying them. The collector went down hard. Marrow was on it in 4 seconds. They were inside before the body stopped moving. The interior of the refrigeration plant had been comprehensively remade. The human architecture was still there underneath. The industrial shelving, the loading dock, the forklift rails in the ceiling. But the pail had overlaid it with their own material, a substance that looked like compressed ash and behaved like hardened resin, layering the walls in thick sheets, running conduits of something luminescent through it in patterns that served purposes none of them could interpret. The air smelled of ozone and something sweeter beneath it that Reyes had learned not to try to identify. The sound was wrong. The pail's facilities always had this quality, a low-frequency resonance just below the threshold of hearing that you felt in your back molars, in the small bones of your ears. After prolonged exposure, researchers at the Austin Enclave had reported vivid dreams. Some of them had reported something worse. Reyes kept moving. The sentinels inside were more numerous than the external patrol. 7 of them that she counted, moving in the slow, predatory arcs that the spheres defaulted to indoors, where they could work the angles, use walls, cut off retreat. They were brighter in here, reflecting the pail's luminescent conduit work. Their surfaces sheened with it. Beautiful, in the way a well-made weapon was beautiful, which was to say functional and terrible. Denny took the first one at 4.5 meters. He didn't hesitate, didn't flinch when it turned toward him with that horrible, singular focus, didn't step back when it accelerated. He stood still, held the device level, and fired it the instant it crossed into range. The sentinel dropped like something had cut every string at once, bouncing twice on the composite floor, going dark. 38 seconds to reset. They were in a corridor, no room to spread out. Marrow took a firing position at the near end. Reyes at the far. Between them, Denny crouched over the device, fingers working the housing. The second sentinel found them at 20 seconds. Marrow put 3 rounds into it before it reached him. The shots landed, the sphere registered them. It actually registered them. She could see the surface dimpling on impact, and kept coming, slower now, its orbit erratic, but still functional, still vectoring for the heat signature of a human body. "Kid," Marrow said, voice flat, controlled. The sphere was 6 meters from him. 3 seconds, Denny said. The sphere was 4 meters out. Marrow took a step back. His heel found the wall. Now. Denny fired the device in Marrow's direction. Half-aimed, the pulse dispersing slightly in the open air. It caught the sphere at 2.5 meters. Not enough. A clean drop, but enough. The sphere went into a spin, lost coherence, and clipped the wall 6 inches from Marrow's left ear before clattering to the floor, active but disoriented. Marrow stepped on it. Twice. It stopped moving. He looked at Denny. Denny looked at him. "Good enough," the boy said, already resetting the device. The cryo-storage chambers were in the building's northern wing. Behind a set of blast doors the pail had partially integrated into their resin architecture. The original steel visible in places through the layered gray material. Marrow pulled the manual release, a lever the pail had not thought to cover, because the pail, whatever their many capabilities, appeared not to have fully modeled what humans would think to use in an emergency. That gap, that consistent underestimation of the small mechanical ingenuity of people who had nothing left to lose, had gotten them into 3 facilities that were theoretically impenetrable. The doors opened. The cold came out in a wave. Even prepared for it, Reyes caught her breath. -68 Celsius, according to the gauge, still mounted beside the blast door. A human artifact the pail had left untouched. The chamber lights were on, faint emergency blue, and in the blue light, she could see the chamber in its entirety. The architect was there. She had seen images. Blurry satellite captures, helmet camera footage from the Vancouver engagement. A single clear photograph, taken at terrible cost by a reconnaissance unit that had not come back. None of it had prepared her for the scale of it. The absolute wrongness of the proportions. The architect standing nearly 3 meters tall in the center of the chamber, dressed in what she could only call formal, the pale equivalent of authority, of ceremony. Something ancient and carefully maintained. It was not moving. It was not in the cryo tank. It was standing in the open air of the chamber. And the cold was not killing it, but the cold was slowing it. She could see that. The minimal physiological motion the architects made, the faint movement of respiration, the subtle adjustment of posture, all of it had slowed to something barely perceptible. And its eyes. The architects had eyes of a specific and horrible gold, not the silver of the sentinel spheres, but older, deeper, a color that suggested the inside of something. Those eyes were open, watching them, aware, still entirely, terribly aware. It could not move quickly, but it was thinking. Marrow walked toward it. She wanted to say something. She had the words assembled somewhere in her chest. The reasonable words about protocols and risk assessments and the 17 different ways this could go wrong. She didn't say them. She'd stopped saying them in Reno. You didn't say those words to Marrow. You either walked with him or you didn't. She walked with him. The architect watched them come. It made no sound. The Pale did not make sounds, not in the register humans processed as speech. They communicated in frequencies that required specialized equipment to even detect. But something changed in the quality of the air around it as they approached. A pressure shift. The resonance in Ray's back molars intensified, and her vision swam slightly, and she thought she heard, not through her ears but somewhere else, a low and ancient and profoundly indifferent voice that said nothing in any human language and everything in a register she couldn't name. The sentinels in the rest of the facility went quiet. All at once. She felt it more than heard it. Marrow stopped 3 meters from the architect. They regarded each other. The old soldier and the alien administrator, one of them slowed by cold, one of them slowed by everything else. Both of them, Rest thought, carrying the weight of the same war from opposite ends. You want something from us, Marrow said. Not a question. The architect did not respond. It couldn't, not in any mode they could receive. But its golden eyes moved, the tiniest fraction of a degree, to a point slightly behind and to the left of Marrow's shoulder. And Ray's turned in time to see the Jody sphere. What Denny called the good one. The Sentinel-class device they'd captured intact 3 weeks ago, and which had been behaving strangely ever since, showing what the Denver engineer had theorized might be a form of retained imprinting, moving through the open blast door to hang in the cold air between them all. It was warm. She could see that. It was radiating heat in the cold chamber, and its chrome surface was fogged with condensation. Denny came in behind it, satchel over his shoulder, pistol in his hand, eyes going immediately and practically to the architect, and then to the Jody sphere, and then to Marrow, calculating. It led me here, the boy said. It's been doing that, leading. I know, Marrow said. You knew, suspected. He didn't take his eyes off the architect. The Pale reused materials. The spheres are built from biological substrate. Someone's biology. Someone who had a relationship with that boy in Tulsa who gave us the cold data before the Pale took him. He paused. Or something like a relationship. I don't know how it translates. Reyes thought about what that meant, tried not to think about it too hard. What do we do? She asked. The chambers, he said. All 4 of them. Full activation, maximum output, sustained for. That's the whole building. Yes. We won't make it out. We'll make it out, he said, with the absolute certainty of a man who had earned the right to lie convincingly to himself. We just need to move fast. He looked at Denny.